My name is Stephen Collis. I'm the acting director this year of the Institute for the Humanities here at SFU, and I'm pleased to welcome you to SFU and to this film screening and talk and discussion. Charlie does Charlie, I guess we could call it perhaps. We're going to watch a Charlie Chaplin film, and Charles Demers is going to say a few words about it and have a bit of discussion at the end, perhaps. I just want to begin by acknowledging the unceded territories that we are gathered on, of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. One quick announcement about an upcoming event. We have the Institute for the Humanities is hosting a conference next weekend, Then and Now, 1968 to 2018. So it's the 50th anniversary of May 68 and the various other, sorry, Devin's not gonna like me walking around, 1968 events from SFU to Columbia University to all over Europe. And various other places. So there'll be 2 days conference here, a variety of speakers and performances from some pretty wonderful international speakers too on Friday and Saturday in the coming week. I think my only other job really is to introduce Charles Demers. I think many people know Charlie. He's a well-known Vancouver stand-up comedian, radio personality. I hate that phrase. It's kind of a weird phrase. Impresario, that's the good word. And an activist and an author. And I believe his most recent book is Property Values, which just came out earlier this year, I think. So please welcome Charlie Demers. Say a few words about Charlie Chaplin.
Thank you. And thank you, Steve, and the Institute for having me. And just to be totally clear, the microphone is not a like a power trip thing. It's to record for posterity. Although Steve does come from the charismatic tradition of anarchism, which stresses loud projected voices. It's a real pleasure to be here. I have kind of a birthright in the Humanities Institute pedigree because I was baptized by Don Grayston, the former chair of the Institute, who also performed my parents' marriage and married my wife and I. So I feel very at home here. So I've prepared some remarks about the film that you're about to see, which is approaching its 100th anniversary, its centenary. So The Kid is Charlie Chaplin's first feature film, essentially. You'll see that it comes in at a much shorter length than what we typically think of as a full feature-length film. It's an 86-minute picture. That's with some cuts that Chaplin made in 1971, just 6 years before his death. But at the time it was made, it was Chaplin's longest feature by far. He was far more known at the time that this film came out for relatively short, single-reel slapstick. And so what you're about to see is a big departure for him. I'll talk more about the historical and political context of the film afterwards. For now, just enjoy it. And if you hear me crying, as I almost certainly will during this movie, I've to date never seen it without crying, just respectfully give me some room, and you can all quietly cry to yourselves in the dark too if you join me, and we'll have the lights back up for the discussion afterwards. Thank you very much for coming. So yeah, I'm now for however many times I've watched that movie without crying, and I know my daughter, who is Josephine, who was the same age as Jackie Coogan was when he made the film. That's not our first time watching it, and it went the exact same way last time. And yeah, I think of Josephine when I watch that movie for obvious reasons, but an experience that I had with Josephine last spring always brings the climactic scene to mind. We were out at the Hard Rock Casino in Coquitlam, which I should explain why before I just say that. She's really lucky. No, we were there doing a support picket for the, it feels a little bit loud, I'm just gonna move it down a little bit. We were there as part of a support picket for BCGEU workers who were on strike for their first contract at the casino. I've performed at that casino as a comedian, and I wanted to go out there. It's very unobtrusive. So Josephine and I were out doing the sympathy picket, and I had her up on my shoulders. And we were walking in front of the driveway, and the idea was to make it at least morally difficult, if not physically difficult, for cars that were entering the casino parking lot. And I was sort of dawdling with Josephine on my shoulders as we crossed the street, and one of the private security guards for the casino said, oh, that's a great dad putting your child in danger. I mean, these cars were not, these cars were as close as they could be to parked. And I turned around, and the security guard had a camera up in my face and said, we'll see what Child Services thinks of this, and took a photo of me. And, you know, there was no issue, there was never going to be an issue, but of course in that moment you just have that same primordial human response that you see on both Jackie Coogan's face, the boy, the kid, and the Tramp's face when they come to take his child away. And so Josephine and I left, and there was a large accident on the highway, and there were sirens of emergency vehicles coming to attend to the accident. But in my sort of anxious mind, these were cops that the security guard had called. They were coming to get my kid, and immediately I went back into that exact mental space of just what do I need to do physically to get, how will I outrun the cops? How will I trick them? There was no, it's a moment that's so human because it's almost animal. It's so reflexive, and it's written all over Chaplin's face in that scene. This is a movie that's often kind of criticized as being pathetic or sentimental, but I think there's a lot more going on than that kind of superficial reading would suggest. The intertitle that kind of was the nucleus for thinking through the content of this lecture is the one that sort of hinges us from the world of the mother, played by Edna Purviance, who's become a star, and the world of the Tramp, where her son is being raised. And the intertitle reads, "Charity, to some a duty, to others a joy." And it seems to be straightforward. It's a way of reintroducing this character with a new sort of sympathetic framing, that she's made good, she's rich, but now she's giving back, and she goes into the slums and she gives away toys to the children. And of course this is the age of silent film, and silent film was not known for its subtle character studies, right? It's all characters are types. They're playing very kind of doing these very anti-Brando pantomimes for the audience, essentially chewing scenery. But I don't think the intertitle card is actually as straightforward as it sounds. It reads, "To some a duty, to others a joy," and the superstar is clearly enjoying herself. She's handing these toys out. The duties that we've seen carried out have been carried out by the little tramp, by Charlie Chaplin's character, by dint of his sort of altruism and his lumpen proletarian ingenuity. The more we look at the moment, the clearer it isn't. It comes only seconds after the actress has handed a tip to an African-American bellboy who has just delivered her flowers, but she delays the moment of payment in order to maximize his sort of obsequious gratitude in the moment. In the next instant, and in starkly warm and human contrast, we see the tramp and the boy, and the father offers his own drinking water for the child to wash off with. This is after we've seen them counting pancakes to make sure everybody gets the same amount of food. And it always reminds me of Barbara Ehrenreich's observation in response to sort of capitalist philanthropy, the world of the Bill Gateses and Bill and Melinda Gates or Bono, and Ehrenreich, of course, who went undercover as a low-wage worker in the United States for her book Nickel and Dimed, has suggested that the real philanthropists in the world are those who do socially necessary labor for wages that they can't survive on. Essentially, there's no greater charitable act than doing stuff everybody needs done for virtually no money. But this seems, especially this year, like a particularly relevant film, which is really hard to say about a 97-year-old movie and really hard to say about a 97-year-old comedy in particular. While there's never been a time where the commercial or political authorities of white North America stopped pulling children away from their loving parents, whether it was the mass legalized abduction of indigenous children for cultural entombment in residential schools, or the sundering of enslaved families sold off to diverging commercial concerns, or just simply working class families robbed of time together by either lax child labor laws or the overwork of their parents. Anyone who's read Volume 1 of Capital knows that a huge section of Marx's first volume is focused on the tearing apart of working class families, essentially the cancellation of working class childhood. He has some gendered stuff about female labor in factories as well, but these are major concerns from the kind of beginning of organized criticism of capitalism. But there's something about the naked brutality of the present political moment and the unwillingness to indulge even in the questionable graces of hypocrisy or evasion that has really drained political morality of its subtlety. And so, yes, this is an unsubtle film, and it's an unsubtle film that has once again become, more urgently relevant in very unsubtle times, with children being, torn apart from their families at the U.S.-Mexico border, for one most sort of flagrant and heartbreaking example, and thrown in cages. I think that critics were always wrong to dismiss Chaplin's movie as overly sentimental, but almost a century after its release, it's clearer than ever that this film has something vital to say to those of us looking to replace the amorality or immorality of capitalism with something better. And I think this is primarily a moral film. I think it's a socialist film, and I'll talk a bit about the political context and Chaplin's own sort of intellectual biography as it relates to the time when this movie came out. But I think this is a movie that addresses something before politics. It's something that addresses these sort of moral first principles of socialist humanity. And I think it's a film that is in dialogue with religious thought, obviously primarily Christian religious thought, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But I think there are real clear cues that were meant to read this in a kind of agnostic religious context. So a bit of historical and biographical context for the film. So the movie was filmed in 1920 and basically 1920 and premiered in 1921. So in the midst of, Charlie Chaplin is the most famous career that was ended by the second Red Scare in the 50s. But this film came out in the middle of the ferment of the first Red Scare, immediately following World War I. We know from Chaplin's autobiography that around this time he's thinking in explicitly dialectical terms. He uses the term dialectics to think about the relationship between comedy and sentimentality. He is the most famous man in the world when he makes this movie, but the last two projects that he's released are both commercial and critical disappointments. A Day's Pleasure and Sunnyside are the two Chaplin films that precede this. Neither one is a big hit with either audiences or critics. A lot of essays are coming out at the time in various periodicals, basically suggesting that Chaplin doesn't have any staying power, that the Chaplin phenomenon is pretty much over, that he just makes these unserious, one-dimensional slapsticks. And this is the film that comes out of his panic around that. Within the period that he's making this movie, his wife at the time, who was very young, she was a 19-year-old woman. She gave birth to their son, Spencer, who died 3 days later. So this is a film that he makes right after losing his infant son. He's also in the midst of divorce with Mildred, who Chaplin sees the production company, the company that he's the film production company that he's under contract with, is trying to use the divorce as a way to put the reels of this film in play, because they don't want him to make a feature-length film. They want him to continue making these short slapstick pieces. And so he leaves California basically in disguise, edits the film in a hotel in Salt Lake City, then goes to New York. And around that time, until the contract negotiations are finished, he's spending time in New York. And as he's in New York, putting the final touches on the film, he's in contact with the New York socialist circles, and he's spending time with socialist writers and socialist thinkers in New York at the time. So his infant son, Spencer, has died after 3 days, and that's obviously a major biographical factor that's going into this treatment of fatherhood and childhood. The other biographical facts that are relevant to the way we think about this movie, I think, are that Chaplin was taken away from his mother and separated from his older brother, Sidney, at the age of 7. So Chaplin's mother was an actor herself. They had ups and downs financially that were usually tied to who Chaplin's mother had as a romantic partner at the time. Chaplin, from what we know, was more than likely born in a Romani or Gypsy camp in Birmingham, and lived mostly in extreme poverty, and raised by his mother, who suffered from severe mental illness. And so at the age of 7, he is put in an orphanage, and his brother, Sidney, is sent elsewhere, and while they're separated from their mother. It's not a permanent separation, but he's gone for, I think, the better part of a year at age 7. This is a founding trauma in Chaplin's life, and it's how he makes sense of everything that he did artistically. And to give you a sense of how he's thinking about his relationship with Jackie, the little boy who, Jackie is the son, Jackie Coogan Jr. is the name of the little boy. Jackie Coogan Sr., who actually played the guy who pickpockets Chaplin in his sleep in the Flophouse. That's the kid's real dad. They were a vaudevillian family. The dad and mom would dance on stage, and then the kid would come out and dance, which is also something that Chaplin did with his mother. When he met Jackie Coogan, who was 4 at the time, he asked him what he did, and I'll get the sentence wrong, but the kid said something like, I am cunning in the methods of prestidigitation, and there's another great, like, $1,000 word that he used. And it's just, Chaplin, by all accounts, is, like, absolutely in love with this boy. And the story that Chaplin tells in his memoirs of how they got that performance out of him when he was crying, they couldn't get him to cry the day that they were filming that. And Jackie's father said that he would make the kid cry. And Chaplin said, don't hit him, don't scare him. And he said, yeah, just give me a minute. And he made him cry. They filmed that scene. This is the story as it's told in the memoirs. And then Chaplin asked what Coogan Sr. had said to Jackie Jr., and he said that if he didn't cry, that they would send him to the workhouse, like take him away from his family and send him to the workhouse. And that when Chaplin heard that, he turned and picked Jackie Jr. up and cradled him and promised him that no one was ever going to do that. He wasn't going to be. And it's one of those stories that it could be made up. I mean, Chaplin was very old when he wrote his autobiography, but if anything, the story tells us more if it's made up, because that's how he was. He was explicitly thinking of this boy as his image, and this film as a way of retelling and rewriting his own life story. So that's some of the context, and I want to sort of make the argument for why I think of this as a moral film rather than a political film, even though I do think it's a socialist film. I'll quote Terry Eagleton from his book After Theory, talking about morality. So this is Eagleton saying, like a lot of radicals since his time, Karl Marx thought on the whole that morality was just ideology. This is because he made the characteristically bourgeois mistake of confusing morality with moralism. Moralism believes that there is a set of questions known as moral questions which are quite distinct from social or political ones. It does not see that moral means exploring the texture and quality of human behavior as richly and sensitively as you can, and that you cannot do this by abstracting men and women from their social surroundings. So I think that there are definitely political pictures that come later. Monsieur Verdoux or Modern Times, those are explicitly political message movies, whereas I think this one really is about that human texture of how we ought to be and how we ought to be with each other. And it's a statement of kind of eternal human morals at a time when the leading segment of the left in Europe and North America is moving towards a utility view of morals. Essentially, the Leninist, Trotskyist view of the class value of morality is coming at this point in the early 1920s to a real sort of salience and in some ways what becomes a decades-long dominance of political thinking about morality on the left, which is that things that advance the revolution are good and justifiable, and that's it. And everything else is up for grabs. And I think Chaplin is saying something different and much more powerful. Frank Kofsky, who's a cultural historian who wrote the first history of Lenny Bruce, called Bruce a secular moralist. And I would say that this film slots Chaplin into the category of an agnostic moralist. I wanted one other quote that I want to read just to sort of frame our conversation is from Simon Critchley's book. It's Simon Critchley's book on humor. So he's talking about the religious interpretation of humor and says, if laughter lets us see the folly of the world in order to imagine a better world in its place, then I have no objection to the religious interpretation of humor. True jokes would therefore be like shared prayers. My quibble is rather the following, that the religious worldview invites us to look away from this world to another, in which, in Peter Berger's words, quote, the limitations of the human condition are miraculously overcome. Humor lets us view the folly of the world by affording us a glimpse of another world, by offering what Berger calls a signal of transcendence. However, in my view, humor does not redeem us from this world, but returns us to it ineluctably by showing that there is no alternative. The consolations of humor come from acknowledging that this is the only world. So I disagree with Critchley and Berger's definition of religion, but I do think this is a helpful way to situate the kid. Rather than Kofsky's secular moralist, Chaplin is an agnostic moralist, engaging in a deliberate and ironic dialogue with Christianity, arguably the most communistic monotheism, and laying out a socialist moral universe that will govern his silent films right up until the crystallizing in the famous speech at the end of The Great Dictator. So how do we know that Chaplin is in a critical conversation with Christianity in this movie? The first is the image of Christ bearing the cross, which gets a full sort of screen, and that's from a part of the film that was heavily, heavily re-edited by Chaplin in 1971. So the film was re-released in 1972, 5 years before Chaplin died, and he cut out whole chunks of the mother's backstory with the father. A lot of stuff came out of the movie. Almost all of it came out at that point. And so the fact that he left the shot of Christ holding the cross in has been interpreted by Chaplin scholars as being fairly significant. Then the movie continuously and periodically reminds us that we're supposed to be thinking about religion. They stop and say grace. The kid wants to say his prayers before they sleep. There's the sort of parable that comes from the rich benefactor about turning the other cheek. And of course, it all culminates in this kind of crazy heaven fantasy sequence that nobody's ever really been able to make total sense of. But I would say that most telling is the trinity structure of the film, since I would argue that each of the three main characters in the picture is Charlie Chaplin. Each one is as legitimate as a symbolic stand-in or surrogate for Chaplin as himself. The easiest read, obviously, is that the Tramp is Charlie Chaplin. He's the fantasy version of Charlie Chaplin who gets to right all these wrongs. But clearly we know that the kid is also Charlie Chaplin, but so is the mother. The mother is someone who goes from the absolute destitution of complete poverty and complete exclusion into this world where she's being feted by these phony baloney theater types who are constantly telling her how great she is. This is the world that Charlie Chaplin was in at that time. Also, the impresario who comes in and is fawning over the woman is the same actor who later plays the innkeeper or the flophouse keeper who takes Jackie to the police. So I feel like there's this kind of profane trinity of mother, son, and Tramp that is the kind of ultimate expression of this conversation with Christianity that's going on. So what are the moral outlines of the Tramp's universe? Because these rules that are set down in The Kid last through all of the silent pictures that feature the Tramp. And the Tramp changes in this movie from the Tramp that moviegoers knew before. So Simon Louvesh, who wrote a sort of intellectual biography of Chaplin, has pointed out that this was the first time we ever saw where the Tramp lived. This is his first sort of expression as a human character who has a backstory, who goes home and sleeps somewhere, who loves people. Until then, he was just this kind of trickster imp who would show up at social gatherings and start throwing pies at swells. And here he becomes the person who we know through films like City Lights or Modern Times. City Lights, Modern Times, The Gold Rush, The Great Dictator, all slot into the moral world that's established in The Kid. So there is a coherent approach to violence. So throughout the Tramp's films, the precedent set by The Kid is respected, which is to say that though the Tramp is always the underdog, he's always the physical underdog, he never initiates violence, he is always willing to fight back in his own defense, physically fight back. Even if it means a cheap shot, including when he smacks the bully with a brick, even though he's never excessive with what he does. So when he feels that the bully has had enough, even though he could take another swipe, he doesn't take that the final hit. The Tramp is also willing, in any case, to use necessary violence to defend those who he loves. So he fights off the agents of the state or the orphanage who've come to abduct his son. This, along with the kind of sexual morality of the Tramp's universe, is one of the major departures from Christianity. It's one of the few ways in which he puts forward the Christian proposition and more or less explicitly rejects it. So we get really close when the actress played by Edna Purviance is quoting scripture, and he's sort of sending it up by hitting this guy with a brick. This is a major theme. The use of legitimate violence in defense or to save loved ones is a major theme in not only The Kid, but in City Lights, in Modern Times, and The Great Dictator. The approach to money or wealth, in the universe of The Kid, money is desirable. And it can be used for good, but only so far as it is external to the individual's humanity. So the mother starlet figure is benevolent because her wealth is almost accidental, and she doesn't cling to it, but instead gives it freely. Those who seek money, like the car thieves at the film's opening, or the flop house owner who ultimately turns in The Kid, are more or less evil. And there's this shot of the sign that says management not responsible for stolen valuables that is in almost every framed shot of the flophouse manager. There's nothing sacred about property, so we thrill to the Tramp and The Kid trying to cheat the flophouse owner out of rent or stealing gas from the meter. Chaplin's Tramp is essentially a petty criminal, a pirate glazier who's replacing windows that his kid is smashing, and we cheer for them. And especially when the window belongs to a cop, especially a cop whose wife then shares a moment of mutual sexual attraction with the Tramp. Sex is another. In the discussion afterwards, and especially in the current context of reevaluating male movie moguls, Chaplin's personal approach to sex and personal philosophy around sex would likely be the moral outlier were he brought into 2018. But within the realm of his films, within the Tramp's moral universe, sex is meant to be fun and pleasurable and mutually so. The only things that spoil sex in this world are jealousy, possessiveness, and Puritanism. So it's worth remembering what a radical thing it was to say in 1921 that a woman giving birth out of wedlock's only sin was motherhood, i.e. no sin at all. Authority and paternalism, there's a very clear and pretty close to anarchist approach to authority in his attitude towards the police, as well as the professional managerial class, represented here by this very contemptuous country doctor. Those who live in poverty are the people who know their own situation best. Help from above is rarely seen as benign and usually comes from a place of ignorance, including from benevolent characters who were meant to see in a positive light. And when outsiders meddle in the business of the neighborhood, they usually miss what is really going on. And there's the inclusion of a shot that's totally superfluous to the plot of the film, so really can only be part of the sort of moral architecture of the film. The shot of the guy out in the street who points the cop in the wrong direction out of the neighborhood. They're safe by that time. He's inside, he's serving the kid food. And so that's entirely about establishing the ethics of this working class neighborhood. So that, we could go on and on about this, and I don't want to, and I'd like to keep this fairly short. So I'll move into sort of some concluding thoughts, and then hopefully we can kick off a bit of a conversation, which is basically about the trouble with comedy. And I think the popularity of Hannah Gadsby's Nanette this year, which is sort of an anti-comedy special. Not anti-comedy in the sense of like Andy Kaufman or Eric Andre, of like uncomfortable, anti-joke, anti-comedy, but an ideological sort of stand against comedy as such. I think the popularity of that special speaks to the ambivalence and discomfort for many on the left, and particularly those on the liberal left, with comedy in general. So liberalism in North America has a very strange relationship to comedy right now, where comedians are like lionized as the hope of humanity and as the leaders of the hashtag resistance, whether it's The Daily Show or Jimmy Kimmel or what. But the liberal left also kind of doesn't like comedy. They lionize comedians, but they don't like that comedy is very messy and chaotic and anarchic and anti-puritanical. So Gatsby's critique is based on the resolution theory of comedy, which is that the joy of comedy comes from our resolving incongruities and contradictions. We're presented with a tension. The punchline reorders it in a way that resolves it in the here and now in a pleasurable way. So her critique is fair of liberal comedy, which can only draw its resolutions to its incongruities from this world. So for instance, if you look at not only the way that late-night comedians approach Trump, but even the way that Jon Stewart approached George W. Bush, the criticism always has to come from a place of, this is an aberration because this isn't the real America. This isn't what's really in our history. Things used to be better. Resolution in this world of comedy has to come from looking backward. And this stalls us out in cynicism. So I think there is real meat to Gatsby's critique of a certain kind of comedy. But beginning with the kid, Chaplin offered another model, which is to resolve the incongruities of this world in an earthly utopia which acknowledges flawed humanity. It is a comedy that not only mocks the miseries of this world and not only signals at a better horizon, or what Berger and Critchley called transcendence, but also offers a non-utilitarian, non-Machiavellian moral guide towards living the good life, whether on the road to something better or stuck in the eternal present. So it's a socialist morality for our own times, whether we're able to change them or not, because its reference are in something imagined. So that's kind of what I had prepared. Thanks so much for watching the movie with me. It's one of my favorites, and thanks for letting me talk about it. And yeah, I'd love, if we still have time, to open things up to more conversation.
I'm just interested in that dreamland sequence that you said people sort of didn't come to any terms about it. It seemed like there was a lot of images in there from folk stuff. I mean, we had sort of Irish leprechauns with harps and European kind of, I don't know, because it was fast and it's the first time I've seen the movie, there was, I thought, a sort of stereotypical Jewish merchant look on the figure on the left-hand side, and they all had the angel's wings, presumably from either the Old or the New Testament, and then it devolves from a bucolic sort of image of, sort of a childlike image of heaven or something, into this basically tearing off the feathers and breaking down into a quarrel.
Yeah.
So I thought it was part of that sort of the dissolving of, or the deconstruction of that, the wishful thinking or something, like that it was a dreamland in the ironic sense of it, a dream that can never be realized.
Yeah.
Because given human nature, it'll always fall apart in that way, which I think is sort of interesting. If you think of that as just limited to folk wisdom or Christianity or something, it seems to fit with your notion of the secular morality of it. But if you think of it as a socialist thing, I didn't quite know what to make of it then. It seemed almost as if the idyll or the promised land of socialism could devolve into that same kind of mess.
Yeah.
So I was sort of wondered what that meant, or what you think it meant.
Yeah, so I appreciate all of those observations, and and just to make things even more complex and uncomfortable, the vamp angel is played by a very, very young girl dressed up to look older. The actress is actually 12 years old when they made this movie. So it's a very strange sequence that I think comes from the fact that if you look at the story, the way it unfolds, it's impossible to have a happy ending. And I would say like a happy ending in the Orthodox, but I mean, there was nothing Orthodox in 1921. They were still deciding how movies went. And I mean, it's not the last time that he does an ambivalent ending. So The Great Dictator ends with him giving this incredible speech in place of the fascist Hitler stand-in. But we don't see what happens to him afterwards. I mean, presumably he's, there's hints that things turn out okay, but that's an ambivalent ending. The ending of City Lights, which is considered one of the, great endings in film, period, is ambivalent. We don't know what happens to the two characters. And the resolution of what I've sort of suggested as a kind of trinity of these three characters is also ambivalent, because it's like, well, what's going to happen now? I mean, they're not going to get married and raise him as a it's not clear. The kid is still in rags, and so I think there is a kind of almost Bruegel kind of like what you're talking about, the idyll of what's the one where they're all lying on their backs? It's a Bruegel painting, and they're in, like it's like heaven, but it's not heaven. It's a different word for heaven. Anyway, where it is, it's weirdly ambiguous because it's human. So they're in heaven in a place where there's this sin is able to creep in, and there's a possessiveness that gets in the way, and you know, when the cop pulls out his gun and shoots this angel down, like, that's pretty bleak imagery, particularly at a time when, you know, we live in the Coen brothers universe, right? Like this, you know, we don't think of it as particularly stark, but like in 1921, a cop shooting an angel down into a heap of like blood and feathers, that's really rough. So I don't know if it's just a kind of, you know, snake eating its own tail of just at every level this fantasy of, but I mean, ultimately I think that's what socialists always have to do, is project a morality that's beyond the horizons of the immediate or achievable world, and that, you know, always ends up landing back down in the real one. But yeah, it's really, I mean, it's a really tough sequence to untangle.
Other comments or questions?
I'm just, like, I don't know. I find the gendered kind of aspects of this film really, like, I don't think I can like it as much as what you're suggesting, because, like, the mother's useless. Like, she's sort of terrible as a character, I think. And so, like, I like that idea of the trinity of the three characters, but, you know, Chaplin's the one, or the Tramp is the one who, when his boy disappears, like, will stop at nothing, right? Mm-hmm. And what does she do? She, like, can't find him, and then she goes on to have this, like, awesome career. Like, and then she knows that the child is with him, but she's the reason that the child gets abducted, because she just, like, puts out the reward for the kid.
Right, yeah.
Right? So, like, and then, yeah, when he shows up, I was like, what's he still doing in those shitty clothes? Yeah. But, like, and the female, like, because you brought up Gatsby, I just keep thinking about Chaplin and the other parts of his story that you talked about in a, what's the word? I'm like in a subtle way, you know?
Or well, no, I mean, I don't think like,
and I just keep thinking about, yes, I see the ways in which he's working something out about himself through this mother figure, but also, like, that he's working out a lot of crap with his mother and with women. And then that heaven sequence, like, that girl just, she's the thing that stands out to me in that heaven sequence is this weird, seductive little girl. Like, so there's so many elements like that in it, so that I can see really profoundly identify, like, as a parent, I get, like, I almost cried too, but, like, the way it figures motherhood is so strange that I feel like it's just such a male universe, and maybe I feel that way about a lot of socialism too. But so yeah, I just want to. I'm not disagreeing so much as saying, like, I just feel ambivalent, because I hadn't ever thought about this film this way before, but I'm finding it hard to not read it the way that I'm not Hannah Gatsby, but, like.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, like,
to reject him, to reject his, like, figuration of family, to reject, you know?
Mm-hmm. So he had a very young wife. He was 29 and she was 19. Like, it's not like the Picasso thing from Nanette. And he, like, you know, he's later basically sort of driven out of the country by, because of a paternity suit that the state knows is not legitimate. Like, blood tests prove that he's not the father, and he's still held legally responsible. He's basically sort of hounded by a kind of literal McCarthyism, but that also comes in under the cover of sexual McCarthyism. I think calling this a male universe is presentism, because in 1921, there's no male figure, certainly not a male heroic figure who's like attaching nipples to the kettle in his house and like making a makeshift potty, and it like the context in which this depiction of essentially a male mothering a child, I think it feels hokey from our perspective now, and it's probably good that it feels hokey, but I mean, whatchamacallit, Kramer versus Kramer or Mr. Mom, I mean, those come out like 60 years after this movie. There's no question that the angel character, I mean, I've already, I find it very weird. I don't really know the way it fits in. I don't feel like the mother is useless in this movie. I mean, for sure there are big plot points that, that she just kind of doesn't. She stops searching once she's lost him. But I mean, the kid also becomes sick, just kind of ex nihilo, because they have to move some of those are exigencies of storytelling, but I always felt like she was also one of the victims of the story. I mean, she's obviously. I agree, obviously, with the broad strokes of what you're saying. I mean, there's no way that if the film were made today that it would be so asymmetrical, that it would just be about him, and he is for sure working out stuff about his own mother. And, Chaplin was known as someone who, and wrote about and thought about and talked about his mother, and by extension women, in very, very contradictory ways. And he was angry at his mother for having been separated from her. And that's something that we know about him, and that is definitely animating this. I mean, not to mention the fact that his wife has just delivered a child that then died, and he goes off to make this movie. So, I mean, it doesn't answer any of the questions that you raised. I just, I'm just a dude, so it doesn't bother me. No, but yeah, I mean, it's absolutely, it is a contradiction. It is a contradiction in the film. But I think there are self-critical, like the fact that the bellboy is black. If you read in Chaplin's autobiography, when he's writing about the picture, so he says, and this isn't exactly how it went, but this is what he wrote in his memoir, that he met the Coogans, the dad and the son, and then heard that another filmmaker had signed Jackie Coogan to a contract. And he says that all of a sudden, this idea for this film basically came whole cloth. Oh, I'd have the little boy, and I'd go, and we would do this, and that he was just despondent because someone else had gotten to this kid before him, and then they found out that he had signed the dad, Jack Coogan Sr., so then he goes and gets the kid and makes this movie. But that in the intervening time, he says that people suggest, oh, why don't you do, it could be you and a little black boy, and so I feel like, I really do think that Chaplin, in some ways, explicitly or implicitly, thinks of Charles Chaplin. Maybe it's more helpful to think about the filmmaker, is the mother, I think. I feel like I feel that there are unignorable sort of cues in the film that she is a stand-in for the real-life successful Charles Chaplin, who goes from what's the word I'm looking for? Total destitution to being this multi-millionaire dandy who doesn't have to fight in World War I and gets to keep living after he loses a romantic partner in the flu epidemic. And so yeah, I feel like a lot of the ambiguities about that character are about him. But that's maybe an idiosyncratic reading.
Well, she can be both, right?
Yeah.
She doesn't have to be one or the other. She
No.
can be, and he can not like himself, too.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, that's all.
Do we want to have one last quick questions? We're rapidly running out of time. Excellent. Thanks.
Thanks, Charlie. I want to hear a little bit more about your thoughts of this as a socialist film, because that's how it struck me from the very beginning. We get this hard critique of capitalism. We have the critique of capitalism's appropriation of state structures that are oppressive. We get all that. But I totally buy your take of the film that it's fundamentally a moral film. And I have a hard time fitting the ethics of the film into a strong, or anything other than an ambiguous support of socialism.
Yeah.
In fact, the examples of sort of equity practice in the film, like the counting of the pancakes, are absurd.
Right.
And what's lovely about that, just to use that since that's the example that I just flashed on, what's lovely about that is that it's based on empathy. And every moral lesson we learn in the film seems to me to be that virtue is based on action founded in person-to-person empathy. And I can't remember how you concluded your talk, but you said generally that you thought that the moral lesson was reflecting on a departure from utilitarianism toward some kind of social values. That's what I'm missing. What I really see this is as a moral lesson in ethics founded in personal empathy. So if you could kind of address that.
Yeah, and so when I say utilitarian, I'm referring specifically to the kind of utility approach to socialist morality put forward by Lenin and Trotsky, which is essentially that.
It's good for us. It's good.
It really is a kind of all means are justified by the ends of the revolution.
I think Bentham and Mill one better.
Yeah, and I think the reason I think this is a grounded and eternal moral kind morality that's being put forward here, and when I say eternal, I just mean like there are first principles that will guide human behavior in any set of circumstances, and I feel like there's such a premium put on survival in this movie, and it's like it really is just whether it's them breaking the windows, which is it's a criminal act, but we buy into it morally because they need it to survive, and he lashes out with really quite kind of brutal violence, and what I love the moment where he chases the driver away, because he chases him the way a dog would chase you from a yard, and he just there's this weird silent standoff where he just runs and kind of fakes him out. threatening. And for me, it's a morality that's like, in the here and now, you have to take care of other people. But the world as it's constituted, management is not responsible for stolen valuables. The people are coming into his world who say, you know, your kid needs a better place to live. And it's like, yeah, of course he does. So do I. Like, and to me, the way these characters take care of themselves, take care of each other while simultaneously taking care of themselves. So it's not the kind of self-abnegation of like ideal Christian charity. It's not martyrdom. He's not giving up his life so that the kid can live. It's the two of them trying to survive together. And that's why I think that moment where he picks up the sewer grate and thinks about it is such a kind of important piece of the ethics of this movie, because it's not a situation where things are going to be easy, and there's an acknowledgement of, so I think it's kind of like it's sort of rooted in this kind of Kropotkin, sort of Tolstoyan mutual aid, this thing of like, by taking care of each other and keeping our eyes on a horizon, whether it's God or equality or some sort of world, that we're living in a way that simultaneously brings us closer to that horizon, but also takes care of people in the here and now. The other thing is that I just feel like every one of the values in this movie slots up flush against socialist values, whether it's equality and tenderness or whatever the kind of like, you know, the counting of the pancakes. I mean, it's ridiculous, but it's so explicit that it's like, you can't, I keep thinking of, you know, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. Like, you need a stack of pancakes. Yeah.
That's what's so funny about it, because the needs are obviously so different.
Yeah.
But just to kind of round off what you were talking about, address the ending then, because what the ending is what makes this an absolute, not just a moral film, but a moralistic film, where by living a virtuous life, and again, virtue as defined in this absolutely coherent moral theory of empathy and compassion, allows you to transcend poverty. I mean, he walks into that house, and it doesn't look like he's ever going to walk out of that house.
No.
And in a way that, I agree with you, completely abnegates the Christian magic wand of heaven. It's a very interesting comparison, but it's not socialist. It's really strongly not socialist.
Also, the only time the cop's a good guy.
Sorry, yeah. Once the cop comes around, you feel like it loses its anarchist credibility. I mean, I feel like it's definitely not Marxian socialism, or it's not what Engels would have called scientific socialism. I do think it is rooted in a kind of like Fabian utopian socialism, and I think that final scene, to me, those three characters are dissolving into a kind of point of oblivion. There's a reason we don't see them after they go into the house, and because they're all the same person, and they can only, you know, when he takes the kid away, you know, and you think like, oh, this scumbag, he just wants the reward. But he is also, in some weird way, doing the right thing. Like, that we wouldn't be happy with this movie if the kid never saw his mother again. And we wouldn't be happy with this movie if he said, you found her, so long, I'm off. And it would, you know, there's also no kind of sensible resolution of like, now they're going to be a couple and this is going to be some nuclearized family. I really think that they go past that door and they dissolve into a kind of eternity.
Yeah,
But they stay in a mansion.
They stay in the mansion.
They don't go back to his garret to live. I mean, it seems like that is the ultimate resolution, is that they all get to be not just dissolve into a single entity, but a single rich entity.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. The kid is wearing patched, like the kid doesn't have anything new. The dad, like, I don't get the sense at all that he's now going to go and, because they live on different levels of reality. I mean, the Tramp is an archetype, and though I think the mother is, like, obviously we see her as an archetype, I don't think that's the intention. I think she's supposed to exist on a kind of more human plane. So I don't, yeah, I mean, they go to the door of this mansion. I mean, the two mansions that we see in the movie, we see them both in these doorway shots, one of which the mother sort of faints in front of, and the other is she brings, the three of them all in. I mean, I don't know the physical plane on which the film could end, and not have those, because them going back to his slum also isn't quite right. So I think that's why we don't see that world. It's like the end of The Godfather. You know, the door shuts and we're on the outside of it. Because the questions that have been put in play in the movie can't be resolved. And maybe that's why there is this weird, ambiguous kind of heaven scene, to keep this sort of rip in the pants open to the metaphysical that, like, that's there for the whole movie.
I think that is a fabulous note to end on, the rip in the pants of the metaphysical.
Yeah.
So thank you everyone for listening and asking great questions. And thanks Charlie so much for talking to us about that.
Thank you.